The vehicle had been sitting in Bay 7 of the Harmon Defense Facility for 19 days. Not parked, not stored, grounded minus the specific embarrassing immobility of a funky, $14 million armored combat vehicle that the United States Army needed operational in 72 hours, and that 50 engineers from 3 different defense contractors had spent 19 days failing to fix. The diagnostic terminals had been brought in on day 2. The manufacturer's technical representatives had flown in on day 4. A specialized transmission engineering team from the vehicle's original production facility had arrived on day 9, spent 4 days, and left on day 13 without a resolution, and with the particular quiet of people who have reached the limit of their expertise and have no additional tools to offer. The Army's Chief of Armor had scheduled a facility inspection for Thursday morning. It was now Tuesday afternoon. Colonel Patricia Mercer, the base's logistics commander, had exhausted every conventional option available to her. She had, at 9:47 a.m. on Tuesday, made a phone call she would later describe, to the small number of people she trusted enough to describe anything to, as the most professionally uncomfortable call of her career. She had called a man named Roy Decker. Roy was 41 years old. He had no engineering degree, he had no defense industry credentials. He had a 3-year-old son named Marcus at the base daycare, a set of tools he had been accumulating since he was 14, and a reputation, in the specific world of people who knew about such things, that had reached Colonel Mercer's desk through a chain of 4 referrals, each one more reluctant and more insistent than the last. He arrived at Bay 7 at 11 a.m. in a truck that needed a new muffler, wearing work clothes that had not been bought for any occasion more formal than the occasion in front of him. Dr. Leonard Case, lead systems engineer for the Harmon project and 18-year veteran of defense vehicle diagnostics, looked at Roy for approximately 4 seconds. "With respect, Colonel," Dr. Case said, loudly enough for the assembled team of 14 engineers to hear, "this is not a problem for a shade tree mechanic. This vehicle uses integrated systems architecture that requires a minimum of a master's degree in mechanical engineering to properly diagnose. Bringing in someone without those credentials at this stage is not going to help. It's going to waste the 2 days we have left." Roy did not look at Dr. Case, he was looking at the vehicle. He had been looking at it since he walked through the bay door, with the specific quality of attention he had been giving broken machines since he was 14 years old, which was the look of someone who was already listening to it. "Can I get under it?" he said. Roy Decker had grown up in a small town in eastern Tennessee, where the nearest dealership was 40 minutes away, and the nearest mechanic who could handle anything more complex than an oil change was 60, a distance that produced in the people who lived between those 2 points either a resigned dependence on distant expertise, or a self-sufficient determination to figure things out themselves. Roy's father Earl had chosen the second option with the particular stubbornness of a man who viewed paying someone else to understand something you could understand yourself as a form of personal failure. Earl had been wrong about many things in his life, but on this point he had been comprehensively, generationally right minus because what he passed to Roy through the transmission of 100 broken machines across a childhood of Saturday mornings, was not just mechanical skill but something more fundamental. The specific confidence of someone who believes that any system, however complex, can be understood if you approach it with enough patience, and enough willingness to begin from what you actually know rather than from what the manual tells you to look for. Roy had never attended college. This was not in his adult reckoning a deficit he compensated for. It was simply a fact about how his education had been structured minus more hands-on, less credentialed, producing a different kind of competence than the institutional pathway produced. Neither better nor worse in absolute terms, but different in specific ways that mattered in specific situations. He had worked across his adult life, in the kind of jobs that brought him into contact with complex mechanical systems at the moment they had stopped cooperating minus breakdown recovery, heavy equipment repair. A 4-year stretch working for a small company that specialized in restoring military surplus vehicles for private collectors, which was where he had first encountered the specific family of armored vehicle systems that would, years later, bring him to Bay 7. The military surplus work, had been the turning point in Roy's technical development, minus not because it was glamorous or well compensated, which it was not, but because the vehicles he worked on were complex enough, and the documentation sparse enough, and the parts obscure enough, that successfully repairing them required exactly the approach his father had instilled, starting from what you actually knew, observing carefully, reasoning from evidence. Not accepting a failure to diagnose as a permanent condition, but as a temporary state of insufficient information that could, with enough patience, be resolved. He had developed, over 4 years of that work, an unusually deep practical knowledge of the engine and drivetrain systems, used in a specific family of armored vehicles, minus knowledge that was not theoretical and was not comprehensive but was, in the particular area where it was deeper than most people who had formal credentials in the field, because formal credentials taught you to understand systems as they were designed to work, while Roy's experience had taught him to understand them as they actually behaved, when they failed. He had left the surplus company when Marcus was born, minus the hours were incompatible with single parenthood, and Roy had made, without drama or extended deliberation, the same kind of clean priority decision that several of the other people in this pipeline had made before him. He had found work closer to home, taken contracts where the hours were predictable, and built a life around the 2 fixed points of Marcus's schedule, and the work that came to him through the referral network of people who had encountered the limits of conventional expertise, and needed something else. Marcus was 3 years old. He spent his days at the base daycare, minus Roy had taken the civilian maintenance contract, specifically because the base daycare was excellent and significantly subsidized for contract employees. A logistical calculation so pragmatic and so characteristic of how Roy approached problems that it made his neighbor laugh when he explained it. Marcus had his mother's dark eyes and Roy's habit of taking apart anything that could be taken apart, a combination that had already produced 2 disassembled remote controls, 1 partially dismantled toy truck, and a bathroom faucet that Roy had arrived home to find in 7 pieces arranged in careful order on the kitchen floor, with Marcus studying them with the focused attention of someone who intended to understand them completely before putting them back. Roy had sat down on the kitchen floor beside him and explained how the faucet worked. Marcus had listened with complete attention. Roy had then helped him put it back together, which had taken 40 minutes and involved 1 small piece that had rolled under the refrigerator, and required a flashlight and a patience that 3-year-olds do not naturally possess, but that Marcus was, with Roy's particular style of unhurried explanation, slowly developing. The faucet had worked perfectly afterward. Roy had filed this under the category of things that were going well. Colonel Patricia Mercer had spent 23 years in Army logistics. A career built on the disciplined management of exactly the kind of problem that Bay 7 currently represented, minus critical equipment, impossible timeline, inadequate resources, no good options. She had a talent for not panicking that her subordinates described as either inspiring or unnerving, depending on their own relationship with visible stress, and she had deployed that talent fully. Across the 19 days the vehicle had been grounded, working through every conventional option in the precise order that good logistics management required, eliminating them one by one, until she reached the end of the list. Roy Decker's name had come to her through a referral chain that had started with a retired Army Master Sergeant named Coleman, who ran a vehicle restoration business in Northern Virginia, and who had, when Colonel Mercer reached him through a mutual contact, said something she had not heard from anyone else in 19 days. "I don't know if Roy can fix it," Coleman had said, "but I know he's the only person I would call if I were you. And I know he'll tell you honestly within an hour whether he can or not, which is more than you're getting from the engineers." She had called Roy the following morning. Bay 7 was large enough to house 3 armored vehicles simultaneously, brightly lit with industrial overheads that turned everything a particular shade of functional white, and currently occupied by 1 grounded vehicle, 14 engineers from 3 contractors. An array of diagnostic equipment that had spent 19 days producing data that nobody had been able to correctly interpret, and the specific atmosphere of a professional group that had been failing at something long enough to have developed a collective, unspoken agreement not to discuss how long they had been failing. Roy walked through the bay door at 11 a.m. and took in the room in The way he always took in a new space, with a broken machine in it minus starting with the machine, not the people. Because the machine was the problem and the people were incidental to the problem, until proven otherwise. The vehicle was a next-generation infantry fighting vehicle, minus not a model Roy had worked on directly, but a descendant of systems he knew well. Sharing enough drivetrain and engine architecture with the surplus vehicles from his earlier career, that he could already from a visual inspection at 20 feet, begin building a hypothesis about what category of failure he was looking at. He did not share this hypothesis immediately. He had learned, over many years of arriving at machines that more credentialed people had already failed to fix. That sharing hypotheses before they were confirmed, was a reliable way to accelerate the dismissal that was already coming and to make it harder to do the actual work. Doc D. Leonard Case had delivered his assessment minus, not a problem for a shade tree mechanic minus, with the full authority of someone who had spent 18 years in a field, and who found the implicit suggestion, carried by Roy's very presence in this bay, that a self-taught mechanic might succeed where he had not professionally insulting, in a way he had not attempted to conceal. The 14 engineers around him had responded with the particular silence of a group, whose collective agreement on something unspoken, had just been articulated by the most senior person present. Colonel Mercer had looked at Dr. Case for a moment, then she had looked at Roy. Roy had not looked at either of them, he was still looking at the vehicle. "Can I get under it?" he said. Colonel Mercer said yes. Roy spent the first 40 minutes under the vehicle with a flashlight in his hands and nothing else. No diagnostic terminal. No reference manual. No consultation with the 14 engineers who were, in the main, pretending to work on other things while observing him with the particular attention of people who had decided to watch something fail, but found themselves watching more carefully than they intended. He was not performing confidence. He was doing the thing he had done with every broken machine since he was 14-, starting with what he could directly observe, building a picture from the physical evidence. Refusing to be led away from what he could see, by the weight of what other people had concluded. The vehicle's symptoms minus, which he had reviewed in the brief conversation with Colonel Mercer before arriving minus, were consistent with a catastrophic drivetrain failure. Specifically, the kind that produced a total loss of power transfer between the engine and the tracks. The diagnostic equipment had confirmed this general assessment and then stopped, because the specific mechanism producing the failure had not revealed itself to any of the standard diagnostic protocols. Roy was not using the standard diagnostic protocols. He was using the specific knowledge minus acquired through 4 years of working on surplus vehicles of a closely related design minus that this family of drivetrain systems had a particular failure mode that the standard diagnostic protocols were not calibrated to detect, because it had been discovered after the diagnostic software was written, and had never been incorporated into the standard testing sequence. The failure mode involved the interaction between the torque converter's lockup clutch and a specific hydraulic pressure regulation valve, minus a failure that produced symptoms consistent with multiple other, more common faults. Which was why standard diagnostic protocols consistently misidentified it, and why the correct repair required knowing both what the actual fault was, and that the diagnostic equipment would tell you it was something else. Roy had seen it twice before. Once in a surplus vehicle that had taken him 3 days to diagnose and 2 hours to fix. Once in a vehicle a fellow restoration specialist had been working on for 6 weeks before Roy had looked at it, and recognized the pattern. He had recognized it again, from the physical evidence visible under the vehicle with a flashlight, at approximately the 30-minute mark of his inspection. He did not say anything at the 30-minute mark. He spent the next 10 minutes confirming what he thought he was seeing, because confirmation was not optional and because he understood, more clearly than most people in this situation, would have, what it would cost him if he was wrong. At 40 minutes he rolled out from under the vehicle and sat up. Daka, waka. Case was standing nearby, watching with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had decided to appear indifferent to an outcome they were very interested in. Torque converter lockup clutch, Roy said. Interacting with a stuck pressure regulation valve in the hydraulic circuit, minus specifically the secondary circuit, not the primary, which is why your diagnostics keep flagging the primary. The software isn't calibrated to look at the secondary in combination with the lockup state. The bay was very quiet. That's not in the diagnostic protocol, Dr. Case said. I know, Roy said. It was discovered after the protocol was written. There were 2 documented cases with surplus vehicles of a related design. Neither of them made it into the standard maintenance documentation. Dr. Case looked at him. The expression on his face was not the expression of someone who had been proven wrong it was the expression of someone in the process of being proven wrong, who had not yet decided how to relate to that experience. You're certain, he said. I'm certain enough to fix it, Roy said, which is the relevant kind of certain. Roy fixed it in 4 hours and 17 minutes. Not because the repair was simple. The repair was methodical, detailed and required working through 3 layers of hydraulic system, access to reach the pressure regulation valve -A. Process that performed correctly, and without shortcuts. Took the time it took and could not be meaningfully accelerated without risking damage to adjacent components that would create a larger problem than the one being solved. He worked steadily, and without performance. He asked for tools when he needed them, from a young army mechanic named Simmons who had been assigned to assist him, and who had, by the end of the first hour, stopped trying to appear merely professionally attentive, and started watching with the frank curiosity of someone learning something they had not expected to learn. Case watched from a distance that gradually over the 4 hours, became a shorter distance, though he did not acknowledge this movement or its cause. The other engineers found reasons to be in Bay 7 during the afternoon, that had nothing to do with their assigned work and everything to do with watching Roy Decker move through a repair that combined person days of their expertise had not produced. At 4:17 p.m., Roy started the vehicle. The engine caught cleanly and settled into a power idle that communicated, to every person in Bay 7, who understood what a correctly functioning armored vehicle drivetrain sounded like, that the problem was resolved. Roy sat in the driver's position for 90 seconds, listening to the system running, checking what he could check from that position, confirming the repair had produced the outcome he had diagnosed. He shut the vehicle down. He climbed out. He went to the small sink at the bay wall and began washing his hands. Simmons was the first person to say anything. How did you know about the secondary circuit? He asked. Saw it before, Roy said. Twice. In this vehicle. Related design close enough. Simmons nodded slowly, the nod of someone storing information for later examination. Dr. Case walked across the bay. He stopped at a respectful distance, minus not the theatrical distance of someone establishing status, but the genuine distance of someone who was approaching a conversation they had not planned for. Where did you learn that? He said. Surplus restoration work, Roy said, drying his hands. About 10 years ago. That failure mode isn't documented in any current maintenance manual. I know, Roy said, it should be. Dr. Case was quiet for a moment. Roy did not fill the silence. I owe you an apology, Dr. Case said finally. What I said this morning was understandable, Roy said. Given what you knew at the time. He dropped the paper towel in the waste bin. He picked up his tool bag. Is there somewhere I can get coffee before I pick up my son? He said. General Raymond Cole arrived at Harmon Defense Facility at 9 a.m. on Thursday morning. Preceded by the particular advance preparation that a 3-star general's facility inspection produced minus a building that was already clean now cleaned more thoroughly. Personnel who were already professional now standing slightly straighter, and a Bay 7 that had, in the 36 hours since Roy's repair, been returned to the state of functional readiness that the inspection required. The vehicle sat in its bay operational. Confirmed through a full diagnostic run that morning that had produced clean results across every system minus including the secondary hydraulic circuit that the original diagnostic software had not been checking. Colonel Mercer briefed the general on the vehicle's repair during the inspection walkthrough with the factual precision that military briefings required and without the kind of narrative embellishment that would have made the story more dramatic and less accurate. The vehicle had been grounded for 19 days, 50 engineers from 3 contractors had been unable to diagnose the fault. A civilian contractor with no formal engineering credentials had diagnosed it in 40 minutes and repaired it in 4 hours. The general looked at the vehicle for a moment. "Where is he now?" he said. "Colonel." Mercer checked her watch. "Daycare pickup, sir. His son's 3. The general looked at her. "Bring him in when he's done," he said. Roy arrived at the base administration building at 4:30 p.m. with Marcus on his hip minus the daycare had closed at 4, and the invitation to meet the general had arrived at 3:47, and Roy had decided, with the practical simplicity that governed most of his decisions, that Marcus would come along because the alternative was making arrangements in 13 minutes that would have required more explanation than the situation warranted. Marcus looked at the uniformed personnel in the corridor, with the evaluating focus of a 3-year-old assessing new environments, decided they were interesting rather than alarming, and settled into the position on Roy's hip that he occupied when he had decided to observe rather than participate. General Cole met them in a conference room that had been arranged with the full formality appropriate to a 3-star general's working meeting and that now contained, at one end of the table, a 3-year-old who was examining the general's uniform insignia with considerable interest. The general looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the general. "That's a lot of stars," Marcus said. "It is." The general agreed. "My dad fixes things," Marcus said. "I know," the general said. "That's why we're here." He looked at Roy. "Colonel Mercer told me what happened," he said. "I read Dr. Case's after-action report as well. He was more candid than I might have expected. He's a good engineer," Roy said. "The fault was outside the documented failure modes." "That's not his failure. That's a gap in the documentation." The general studied him for a moment. "That's a generous read of someone who called you a shade tree mechanic in front of his entire team," he said. "He was working with what he knew," Roy said. "Same as everyone." The general was quiet for a moment. "I want to talk to you about a consulting arrangement," said. "Specifically regarding undocumented failure modes in this vehicle family. You've seen 2 cases that aren't in any maintenance manual. I'd like to know how many more there might be, and I'd like the people who maintain these vehicles to know what you know." Roy looked at Marcus, who had found a pen on the conference table, and was examining it with the focused attention he gave everything mechanical. "Marcus, don't take that apart," Roy said. Marcus set it down with the specific expression of someone deferring rather than agreeing. Roy looked back at the general. "What kind of hours are we talking?" he said. "I have a pickup at 4 every day, we'll build around it." The general said. The consulting arrangement formalized over the following 3 weeks. Roy's role, as structured by Colonel Mercer with the pragmatic efficiency that made her good at her job, was narrow and specific: document the undocumented. Every failure mode he had encountered, across his years of surplus vehicle restoration work that did not appear in current maintenance manuals, was to be recorded, contextualized, and submitted for incorporation into the formal maintenance documentation used by Army vehicle mechanics. It was not glamorous work. It was not highly compensated by the standards of the defense contracting industry. It was, by Roy's assessment, exactly the right work minus the translation of knowledge that had accumulated informally, in surplus bays and on cold floors, and in the particular school of understanding that comes from confronting broken things, without the safety net of a protocol that already has the answer, into a form that would survive his own individual memory and become useful to people he would never meet. Dr. Leonard Case submitted a formal recommendation to the vehicle's manufacturer that the secondary hydraulic circuit interaction failure mode be incorporated into the next revision of the standard diagnostic software. He submitted it under his own name, as the senior engineer on the project, with a documented attribution section that named Roy Decker as the source of the diagnostic insight. Roy had not asked him to do this. Case had done it because it was accurate, and because in the specific reckoning he had conducted privately in the days since the repair, accuracy had come to seem more important than the version of events that would have been more comfortable for his own professional narrative. The software revision was incorporated into the next maintenance update, distributed to vehicle maintenance units across 4 Army installations. Roy's name appeared in the attribution footnote of the technical bulletin that accompanied the update. Nobody outside a narrow professional community read technical bulletins. Roy did not read this one. He learned about it from Simmons, the young mechanic who had assisted him during the repair, who had been assigned to the vehicle maintenance unit and who texted Roy a photograph of the footnote with the message, "Thought you should see this." Roy looked at the photograph. He showed it to Marcus, who looked at it with the evaluating attention he gave everything, and then asked if they could have pancakes for dinner. Roy said yes. On a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after the repair, Roy took Marcus to the base's Family Open Day, an annual event that opened several of the facility's non-restricted areas to dependents and community members, including, this year, static display of vehicles in Bay 7 that the public could walk through and examine. The repaired vehicle was among the display units. Roy stood in front of it with Marcus on his shoulders, looking at the vehicle, the way he always looked at machines, not with sentimentality exactly, but with the specific attention of someone whose relationship with a thing goes deeper than its surface. Marcus looked at it with the same attention. "Did you fix that one?" he asked. He had, apparently, retained more from the preceding weeks than Roy had tracked. "That one," Roy said. Marcus considered the vehicle with increased interest. How? Roy thought about how to explain torque converters, and hydraulic pressure regulation valves, and undocumented failure modes to a 3-year-old standing on his father's shoulders at a military open D. I listened to it, he said. Until I understood what it was telling me. Marcus looked at the vehicle for a long time with the focused evaluating attention that Roy recognized as the family inheritance. It clearly was minus the look of someone deciding they were going to understand something, and that the understanding was worth the time it would take. "Can you teach me?" Marcus said. Roy looked up at his son silhouetted against the bay lights, 3 years old, already asking the right question. "Yeah," Roy said. "I can teach you." He shifted Marcus more securely on his shoulders and walked toward the vehicle, so his son could see it more closely. Behind them, Bay 7 filled with families and children and the ordinary warmth of a Saturday morning, minus the same bay where 19 days of failure had ended in 4 hours and 17 minutes of careful, patient, undramatic work by a man who had learned, from his father, that any system could be understood if you were willing to begin from what you actually knew. Some people learn from manuals. Some people learn from machines. The difference, in Bay 7 on a Tuesday afternoon, had been exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes, and a question that nobody else had thought to ask.